Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second of our summer book talks. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programs like this one free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by my distinguished colleague, the historian Tiya Miles, who'll discuss her new book, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake. Tiya is a Radcliffe alumni professor and a professor of history in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, where she directs the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. Tiya also is a member of the faculty committee of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, which is anchored at Radcliffe. And I'm so glad for this opportunity to discuss a topic that is related to the work of that initiative. In addition to All That She Carried, Tiya is the author of 5 other books, including The Dawn of Detroit, a chronicle of slavery and freedom in the City of the Straits, which won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, among other awards. And she's received numerous other honors, including a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Harvard's President Emerita and Radcliffe's founding dean, Drew Kilbin Faust, has reminded us, to quote her, that slavery was not an abstraction, but a cruelty inflicted on particular humans. We name the names to remember those stolen lives. Drew made those remarks at the dedication of a plaque naming Titus, Venus, Villa, and Juba, 4 people who were enslaved at Wadsworth House on Harvard's campus. Nearly a century earlier, in 1921, Ruth Middleton did something similar. She named Rose and Ashley, her enslaved great-grandmother and grandmother, respectively. Ruth recorded their stories in hand embroidery on a sack that Rose had given Ashley, fearing that the 9-year-old girl would be sold away following the death of their legal owner, Robert Martin, in 1852. We learn from Ruth's inscription that Rose and Ashley were indeed separated in the disposition of Martin's South Carolina estate, and that they never saw each other again. In All That She Carried, Tiya traces the family history of Rose, Ashley, and Ruth. In doing so, she recasts the broader story of the United States and of African Americans from the 17th century through the 20th, drawing important connections to our present. I'm delighted to have Tiya here with us today to share from this powerful work. We'll begin our program with a brief reading from the book, followed by a conversation. After that, we'll open the virtual floor to audience questions. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time. We only ask that you keep your questions brief so that we can address as many as possible. Now, it's my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Tiya Miles.
Thank you so very much, Dean Brown-Nagin, and thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you and with the Radcliffe community about my new book. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to read 2 passages from the introduction, which is titled Love's Practitioners. And the epigraph to the introduction is as follows. In African-American life, Black women have been love's practitioners. Bell Hooks, Salvation, Black People and Love, 2001. Here in these pages, we take up a quiet story of transformative love, lived and told by ordinary African-American women, Rose, Ashley, and Ruth, whose lives spanned the 19th and 20th centuries, slavery and freedom, the South and the North. Their love story is one of sacrifice, suffering, lament, and the rescue of a tested but resilient family lineage. By loving, Rose refused to accept the tenets of her time, that people could be treated as property, that wealth was a greater value than honor, that some lives had no worth beyond capital and gain. Hers is just one telling example of refusal from the collective experience of enslaved Black women who practiced love and preserved life when all hope seemed lost. Even when she relinquished her daughter to the slave trade against her will, Rose insisted on love. Despite enduring their separation, Rose's value of love prevailed. The emotional bond between mother and daughter held longevity and elasticity, traversing the final decade of chattel slavery, the chaos of the Civil War, and the red dawn of emancipation, before finding new expression in the early 20th century, just as a baby girl, the fifth generation of Rose's lineage, Ashley's great-granddaughter, was born. Just as remarkable as the story of women who dared to insist on love is how we have come to know about it. Rose's testament, as told by Ruth, is preserved on an antique sack that once held grain or seeds. Traces of the abused and adored, the devalued and the salvaged, the lost and the found accrue in this one-of-a-kind object. A mother bears the sacrifice of her daughter. A daughter carries on amid unspeakable loss. A descendant heaves the harrowing tale into the 20th century, and we have the chance to be the better for its arrival here on our doorstep. Through the medium of the sack, we glimpse the visionary fortitude of enslaved Black mothers, the miraculous love Black women bore for kin, the insistence on radical humanization that Black women carried for the nation, and the immeasurable value of material culture to the histories of the marginalized. Although Black women have been treated like the mules of the world, in the words of writer Zora Neale Hurston, this sack bears them up at times as exemplifying, to borrow Abraham Lincoln's phrase, on the precipice of civil war, the better angels of our nature. Ruth Middleton, a lineal descendant of Rose, embroidered the lines that follow on what Ruth identified as the original cotton sack that Rose packed. Quote, "My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. With these words, a granddaughter, mother, sewer, and storyteller imbued a piece of fabric with all the drama and pathos of ancient tapestries depicting the deeds of queens and goddesses. She preserved the memory of her foremothers and also venerated these women, shaping their image for the next generations. Without Ruth, there would be no record. Without her record, there would be no history. Ruth's act of creation mirrored that of her great-grandmother Rose. Through her embroidery, Ruth ensured that the valiance of discounted women would be recalled and embraced as a treasured inheritance. The stained antique fabric, once grasped in Ruth Middleton's hands, now hangs in an underground case at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The artifact, which is on loan from its current owner, the Middleton Place Foundation in Charleston, South Carolina, immediately takes hold of those who view it. Ruth's intellectual work of interpreting Rose and Ashley's story and her handiwork in stitching it onto the sack in color produce a composite object of arresting visual and emotional impact. A testament to the national past, fashioned of many thinning threads, it has an effect subtler yet more moving than the stone monuments built for pro-slavery statesmen and Confederate generals that have been widely contested in recent years. Those memorials, erected to bury a nation's sin, were made to be larger than life to command a presence in national memory. At the same time, though, Confederate monuments undermined the aspirational principles of America's founding: freedom, equality, and democracy. Ashley Sack makes no such pretense to vainglory. It does not have to. A quiet assertion of the right to life, liberty, and beauty, even for those at the bottom. The Sack stands in eloquent defense of the country's ideals by indicting its failures. The Sack crystallizes the drama of a region and a nation torn apart by the moral crisis of human sale and forced separation. But it also possesses a quality so tangibly intimate and personal that it filters a light of remembrance on the viewer's own familial bonds, leading any of us to ask what things our own families possess that connect us to our past, and to wonder what we might gain from the contemplation of that connection. Such is the capacious nature of Ashley Sack that it can call hearts to attention, while also speaking to local, regional, and national histories. Although the bag's material contents have long been lost, its essential provision, love of a mother for her daughter, still remains. Every turn in the sack's use, from its packing in the 1850s to its tending across the dawn of a century to its embroidery in the 1920s, reveals a family endowment that stands as an alternative to the callous capitalism bred in slavery. In the face of the base commercialization of their own bodies, these Black kinswomen cared for one another, preserving the next generations by provisioning their perseverance and remembering the past generations who defended their right to life. As the women in Rose's lineages carried the Sack through the decades, the Sack itself bore memories of bondage and bravery, genius and generosity, longevity, and love. And I have a second brief passage that I wanted to read for you, Tamiko, and everyone who is with us. And this passage talks more about the process of passing the Sack down and the meaning of material things. Aptly called a revelation by a museum interpreter at the Middleton Place plantation, Ashley Sack illuminates the contours of enslaved Black women's experiences, the emotional imperatives of their existences, the things they required to survive, and what they valued enough to pass down. For without their possessions, Black women, like any other people, could not sustain or express their lives. Although it may seem counterintuitive at first, attention to material things, especially ones elaborated by words or pictures, opens a route to accessing intangible feelings and desires that can evade the documentary record. Humans are composite beings, made of matter and infused with spirit. We have always collected, created, and surrounded ourselves with material objects in order to express that inner ineffability. Quote, "The things we interact with are an inseparable part of who we are," as one historian of the environment has put it. And hence things become our fellow travelers in this lake. The physical traces left behind therefore allow us to glimpse what our forebears found worthy of making and keeping, and what by implication they held dear. What did Rose value enough to save, pack, and carry? How did she turn her vision of what mattered in life into action? The things Rose gathered for her daughter, according to the memory of her great-granddaughter, indicate her thoughts and guiding principles. Rose sought to immediately address a hierarchy of needs: food, clothing, shelter, identity through lineage, and most centrally, an affirmation of worthiness. The wise values upheld by Rose reverberate across the testimony of African American women from the slavery era. Rose's kit was, by all evidences, one of a kind, but she shared with other women in her condition a vision for survival that required both material and emotional resources. Rose supported Ashley's life through the collection and storage of stuff, a dress, nuts, a lock of hair, and the cotton tote itself, things shaped by the intermingling of Southern nature and Southern cultures. Rose then sealed those items, rendering them sacred with the force of an emotional promise, a mother's enduring love. The inscription on Ashley's bag contains a list that is nothing less than a prescription for survival. It allows us to appreciate what women in bondage deemed essential, what they were capable of getting their hands on, and what they were determined to salvage. We save first that which we value most. Rose was determined to rescue her daughter. She understood, as did other Black women with their backs against the wall of entrenched dehumanization and impoverishment, that survival for future generations meant fusing together whatever one had, the material and the emotional, or making love. The work of Rose's hands, as captured by her great-granddaughter's words, illuminates the importance of materiality as well as emotionality to Black women's survival strategies.
Right. Thank you so much, Tiya, for that beautiful reading. And I hope that over the course of our conversation, we can unpack some of the concepts that you speak about in your book. And I want to start at the beginning. Ashley Sack is a remarkable family record and a piece of history. How did you first learn about the Sacks' existence, and what questions were you hoping to answer by making it the subject of a book project?
I first learned about the Sack in an unusual way. I did not learn about it from a historical record or from a historical monograph. I learned about it while I was at an environmental history conference in Savannah, Georgia. I had given a talk about some other research that I had been doing on haunted places in the US South. And after the talk, a local journalist who was a retired marine biologist came up to me. He waited at the end of a very long line, actually, and was finally standing alone and came up and asked me if I knew Ashley Sack. I thought his language was interesting. He was asking me if I knew what seemed to be an object. And I told him that I didn't know this thing. And he told me that I had to see it. After the event, Ben Goggins, the journalist and retired scientist, started emailing me. He emailed me that very night. And he sent me links to images of the Sack. He sent me links to his own writing because he had been one of the first to hear about the Sack in the local area when a Middleton Place curator came to Savannah and presented about it. And he, in his various emails, really urged me to think about a number of interconnected themes, including loss and survival and even environmental threat, because he talked about the flooding that was taking place around St. Simon's Island and around Tybee Island in the Savannah area. So once I did see the Sack, both in image and then finally, and especially in person, because that is when it really gripped me, Tamiko, when I saw it in person. Once I finally saw the Sack, I felt compelled to write about it. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before in the archives of enslavement, the material culture of enslavement. It was so beautiful and terrible and concentrated and real that I almost felt like I could fall into it. And so I changed my plans for the book that I wanted to write next. I decided that I needed to write about this book with the great deal of gratitude to that journalist in Savannah. And I wanted to try to answer first the most basic questions of who are the people who are mentioned in the embroidered writing on the Sack? And what were their lives like? And what was the context of their experience? And then beyond that, I wanted to ask questions about the Sack itself, where it was made, when it was made, who made it, and what were the details of its material manufacture, and use in reality. And these questions led me to larger questions about how the story of the women and the story of the sack might enable us to see more clearly or more deeply or with greater depth or with greater breadth the experiences of enslaved Black women, which are so hard to get at through the written records.
Wonderful. That's a great story about the conversation with the journalist, and we all thank him for leading you to the sack. Certainly the perfect person to write this story. So I want to ask you about the type of book it is. All That You Carried is written for a broader audience than many in academia are accustomed to speaking to. You received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Program, and that grant required you to write the book in a way that translates scholarly ideas for audiences beyond academia. So you were following that mandate. And yet the question is, what made you want to write a public history? And how did your desire to write a public history shape the way you thought and wrote about the sack?
Thank you for that question, Tamiko. It's a wonderful question. It's so fitting for this project. I consider all of my books to be public histories. And by that, I mean that I have taken up my various projects with an intention of having the work be usable, having the work be applied to various questions or problems or needs of our contemporary everyday communities. In addition, I have felt that the public history framing of my work has meant that I should work collaboratively with others who have, in many cases, much more knowledge than I would have or than an academically trained scholar might have of a particular object, item, question, or place. And I also think that public history needs to be widely accessible. It needs to try to speak to not just one audience, actually, but multiple audiences. It needs to try to speak in the language and the languages that would be received by those audiences. And it needs to do work, ideally in the best interest of the public. But even though I think of all of my books in this way, your question was apt because this book was different for me. When I saw the sack, my own reaction to it was much more emotional and even much more internally dramatic than my own reactions to other projects that I had worked on. And as I began to talk to curators who had worked with the sack and to read the work of scholars who had begun to research the sack and write about it, it became clear that this was not just an idiosyncratic reaction. This object seemed to pull lots of people into it. And it seemed to encourage many people to just pause and to reflect and even to express their own feelings about the story on the sack itself, as well as stories in their own families' histories. So, for example, I have heard people say that when reading the words on the sack, they were sent right back in their own memories and lives to a moment of personal separation from their family member. So this object was connecting with people in a way that was special and that was rare. And so telling its story and telling the story of the women who packed it and handed it down and carried it and embroidered it had to be a story for the public. It feels like it is an object that is meant for people to be able to access and to think about and to learn through and to even feel through, that is to experience their emotions through. It's a conduit in many ways. And so the very nature of the thing itself pointed me even more in the direction of public history than I had already been moving. And so I did apply for the NEH grant that you described because I thought that, first of all, I needed to have a sense of kind of affirmation and confirmation that this was a project that was doable and that was doable by me. And this is something that I think grants can do and fellowships can do in perhaps a unique way. And they can affirm for the grant writer, they can affirm for the person proposing a project that there are other people who are expert in their fields, who have read the questions, read the hypotheses, and are willing to say, yes, we think this is something that should be pursued. So receiving that grant was very important for my confidence in taking up the project that was really difficult. And that by that time I had learned some other scholars had considered, but decided not to take up.
Right. So let's talk about some of those difficulties, Tiya. So you have this wonderfully evocative artifact. Part of your task as an historian was to find Rose and Ashley and Ruth and other historical records. And this is complicated. Complicated by what you've called the conundrum of the archives, which is that we have markedly fewer records about people of color, about women, about other socially marginalized groups throughout history. And so talk to us about how you navigated those gaps, how you interpreted the absences in the archives. What other sources did you turn to?
Well, I mean, right, Tamika, we have many fewer sources in the histories of Black people, people of color, women, other marginalized groups than we have about, let's say, mainstream central figures in US history. That's just a fact and a reality of the nature of this work. But in addition to that, we also are missing sources for every single aspect of history. I mean, as you know, doing historical work is all about trying to find the pieces that will help us to kind of piece together a facsimile of what took place in the past. We can never fully achieve it, no matter what our subject matter. And in the case of African American people, Indigenous people, and their experiences of enslavement, that inability to reconstruct the past wholly and fully really stands out all the more. And so this is a topic that people in our fields continuously talk about and try to articulate and try to put language to the issue of how the archival repositories where records are saved and organized and preserved, and to which historians and other scholars turn, have severe deficits when it comes to many groups. So what do we do in this situation? We could decide, well, there's just not enough there. We won't be able to put together a convincing argument or piece together a full picture. So we might as well just put that to the side and choose a topic that will be more reliable as we pursue the evidence to explore it. But if we were to do that, what will we know about Black women in this period or about Native American women in this period? What could we find out about enslaved people? Very, very little. Or what we found would really be predefined and circumscribed by those who had the legal power, the economic power to make and keep records. Typically, those who owned Black people or those who owned Indigenous people as their slaves, as their property. That is a serious, serious problem. It's a heartbreaking problem to feel that we are trapped, that we would be trapped by the words of those who possessed our ancestors. And yet, those words make up a good portion of the scanty evidence that we have, and I feel that we have to turn to them. And so I tried to do that in this book. I tried to turn to the more traditional records, but that is not enough. We would be doing a disservice to our subjects if we were to let enslavers and slaveholders speak for the enslaved. We can't do that. It's just wrong. It's just ethically wrong. And so we, by necessity, must turn to other kinds of sources, to a range of sources. We have to think creatively. And luckily, the real challenge of this project was also the gold in this project. I just had a sack to work with, basically, a sack with some beautiful but very spare lines stitched onto it. And the work of a handful of other scholars who had begun to piece it together, also based on the sack and some contextualizing documentary evidence. That limitation forced the kind of creativity that I never would have arrived at if I had had, 300 or even let's just say 10, 5, let's just say 5 documents about this family. And this push toward thinking more openly, more broadly, thinking about adjacencies, kind of what stands next to and around the document and the story, is what led me to look very closely at the narratives of enslaved Black women, to look very closely at letters written by or dictated by enslaved people who had nothing to do with this sack, but could help me to open up its story. And also to look very closely at material culture, at handicrafts, and even contemporary art by African-American artists, which include a number of associations and connections with the story of Ashley Sack.
Mm-hmm. So, Kaya, I'm listening to you talk about this project, the challenges of it, and you're a gifted, creative historian, and not everybody can actually, construct this kind of compelling story from a record. The record that you had, which was limited. And so I wonder, and this is partly for benefit of, students who are studying history and others, can you talk about what your guiding principles were in filling in those gaps? Or, if we think about the story as a puzzle, how did you construct the four corners of the, what are the boundaries?
I love that, Tamiko. I love it. And I'm actually terrible at puzzles. During the pandemic, one of my daughters became puzzle obsessed. And she would put together these, 1,000, I don't know how she did it, these 1,000-word puzzles all across the dining room table. I would come in and look at what she was doing and just ask, where did you begin? How do you do this? I had no idea. So I love it that you phrase the question in that way. What are my corners? Okay, so the sack is at the middle, and at the corners are larger contextual kinds of questions, like what was the experience of Black women in the early to mid 19th century? That question can be like a pin holding down one corner of the puzzle. And we do have information that can help us get at that question. Again, it's not going to be everything that we want. It's not going to be full enough, but we have, again, as I mentioned earlier, the narratives of enslaved women. We have letters, we have photographs, we have as told to stories, we have oral histories that can help us to pin that down and fill it out. And then another corner of the puzzle would be the layered histories of places, starting from the nearest place to the sack, and then stretching out to the place at the farthest point from the sack, but that still has meaning for it. And so for me, that was thinking about Charleston, it was thinking about the interior of South Carolina, the US South, the United States, and even to an extent, thinking about global questions. That's not my area. I'm not a global historian, but of course, the story of cotton is a broad one. And I think the story of a woman who was determined to save someone's life, to save her child's life, when the possibility of doing so seemed so far out of reach. That is a global issue right now, I think, in our current moment of climate change. So that's another corner of the puzzle, thinking about place and broadening that out. Another corner of the puzzle, and maybe this is surprising. This is more of an American studies method, and I am trained in American studies, and people who have taken American studies courses, you mentioned students, Tamiko, students in American studies who are listening to this, I think will feel that this makes sense with what it is that they have studied and how it is they raise questions. Another corner of the puzzle is actually Black women's contemporary theorizing about the history of Black women and Black people and about slavery. So in this corner, I would put items like Tiya Hartman's theorizing about slavery in the archives. I would put items like Alice Walker's writings. I'd put items like novels that can tell us about the experiences of enslavement in a way that is certainly imagined, but that can get at an emotional or interior kind of truth about the experience that we can't access through historical documents. So that's another piece of the puzzle, looking at contemporary Black women's creative work, written work, and also visual work. And another corner, I only have 4 corners, right? So for the fourth corner of this puzzle, I would say secondary literature in the fields that surround the SAC. And so for me, that included object history, it included African American history, it included a category of thinking about things, kind of a philosophical category. It included material culture history, Black women's history. And let me just add a little footnote to that last point about Black women's history. I'm here in this corner of the puzzle where I'm talking about secondary literature. A really important idea is taking Black women's accounts of their own lives as theoretical analysis of their lives and their time periods. And this notion comes from the secondary work of looking at Black women as intellects and as intellectual historians of their own times and of past times.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for that, Tiya. Let's talk about material objects as windows into the past. You've said in your reading that that might seem like a counterintuitive move. And I imagine that a part of the reason you say that is because today we have so many objects. We have so much stuff. Let's use that word. I mean, stuff. We have all of these possessions, so much so that there are whole genres of books and television that are dedicated to helping us manage the volume of things we've accumulated. And so against that backdrop, I wonder if you could talk about what makes material objects such a rich guide to people's lives, to people's values throughout history, and particularly for marginalized people.
As you asked that question, Tamiko, I was thinking about all of those shows, some of which I have actually watched a fair amount of, that are about organizing your things, right? You know, how to roll your clothes and, you know, put them in the drawer in the proper way. We have a problem in our contemporary culture, you know, those of us who are privileged to have plenty of material resources, with collecting too much stuff. And with being dominated by an acquisitive kind of approach to our lives, in which we are sometimes or even often trying to earn, to buy, you know, to acquire and to save and to stockpile hoping that will satisfy some kind of desire that we have, and then needing to do the thing again. I am certainly someone who's caught up in that as well. I think that this is a shared aspect of American culture right now. And so I am not someone who would have turned immediately to thinking, let me write a book about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I probably would have been kind of opposed to that idea of focusing on things. But there are at least two important aspects of thingness or material culture that I learned through this book, which I think actually give us perspective on our contemporary desire to shop and to collect things.
Mm.
And one of those is that for African Americans in the period on which this book focuses, principally the 19th century and early 20th century, having things was no small matter.
Mm.
And in fact, most Black people before the Civil War who lived in this country were themselves defined as things, considered to be possessions, owned, sold, traded, passed down through wills. And the thingness of their lives was an abuse against them.
Mm.
Black people were considered to be possessions, and they had a very hard time obtaining possessions. They weren't usually able to earn money. When they could earn money, it was very difficult to do so. They had to overwork, they had to get permission from their enslavers to be able to work outside of that particular household or that plantation environment and maintain a part of their earnings. So they had to work double, triple, quadruple time to earn just a little bit of money. They could try to acquire things, but the things could be taken away from them. And even after emancipation, Black people had a hard time holding on to things because many Black people were deeply impoverished.
Mm.
They couldn't maintain their things. They were constantly in motion because they were running from racial violence, often trying to move to greater opportunity, and they couldn't hold on to the things that they had even managed to acquire. So things held important value for Black people who recognized a thin line between actual things defined as such and their own persons and their own bodies, and who also had a very hard time acquiring things and holding on to things and preserving things. So we're talking about a really different kind of relationship to objects in this period for Black people than in our moment and for many of us. In addition, material objects, things, stuff became very important in this book. And I learned about them in this book in a different way because I was brought closer to the recognition that it really is out of material sources and items and objects that we as human beings fashion our lives and make sense of our lives and communicate about our lives. I mean, even right now, you and I are having this conversation, and we both have things behind us. You have books behind you, you have a family photo behind you, I have a quilt behind me. And I don't know if you can see the top of this. This is a photograph behind me. And the top of the quilts on that shelf, these are all objects that belonged to my grandmother, who has now passed on, but you know, I cherish these things from her. They help me to know who I am, and they signal something about who I am or something that I hope to be or hope to project to others. And I think likewise for the books behind you. Things are a part of the material that we use to make our lives. And I know that seems like an obvious statement. You know, we look around and we see, yeah, there's a wall, there's a door, you know, here's a water bottle, here's a book, here's a backpack. It doesn't belong to me, it belongs to my daughter, but here's, you know, here's another object here. And all of these things support us. They make our lives possible. They remind us of who we want to be, and they convey who we hope we are to others. That is a really important meaning of things, of stuff that I learned through working with this stack.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to audience questions in just a moment. But first, before we do, I would love for you to talk about the contents of the sack and the significance of them.
The contents of this sack are magical in a way. I think they're sacred in a way, Tomiko. They're also very basic. And I think they address the most foundational needs that Rose may have thought Ashley would have as Ashley was being sold away from her. So the sack itself is a thing, and the sack itself was one of the items that Rose was passing on. And it included a dress. A dress is a very important object, as I tried to explore and to explain in the book, for all the things that it could bring to not only a young girl, but also a young enslaved girl. Rose also packed food. She packed nuts. And I learned through researching this book that the pecans she packed are a very special kind of nut. But as I started doing this work and thinking about it more and more, Tomiko, I came to realize Rose must have been a brilliant person, right? But everything she packed has so many additional meanings and so many uses. And I can't even imagine how she got her hands on these things. But she packed the dress. She packed pecans, which are incredibly nutrient rich, it turns out, and which also were a luxury good in the area where Rose and Ashley lived in South Carolina. So the pecans could have been traded for other items. They could have been used for their exchange value. Rose also packed a braid of her own hair. And this is a hauntingly beautiful object that was in the sack. This is the object that I think comes closest to that idea of the sacred that I mentioned, because it was, in many ways, a spiritual connector to Rose herself. It was a part of Rose's own body. And it also, I think, represented Rose's autonomy and her independence. And it represented the message of that independence that was being conveyed to Ashley. Because technically, Rose didn't own her hair. She didn't own her body. Her enslaver did. So for Rose to actually cut her own hair and to give it to her daughter meant taking possession of her own body, taking possession of that body back for the purposes of reminding her daughter that they would be connected, which I think is just an incredibly rich thought and action. And of course, the sack contained love, and there's so many ways that we can think about that. In the embroidered inscription on the sack, love is at the center of the embroidery, and it's in large red letters. So love was clearly very important to Ruth and to her memory of the exchange. And I think that we can infer it was important to Rose because this was a story that would have been handed down across the generations.
Thank you. I want to allow the audience to have a voice here through their questions. And there's a question here about your writing process, where there's an audience member who's very curious about it. He or she notes that the citations and footnotes were amazingly comprehensive and helpful, is one thing. So you might talk about why you took that approach. And then another question there is about whether you write in one voice through and then another voice personally.
Okay, very interesting questions about writing, which I appreciate, and I want to think those through. First of all, thank you for reading the footnotes. I love it when I hear that people are reading the footnotes because I do spend a lot of time on them and I do work hard on them. And there is a reason for that. I tried to write this book in a way that was creative. And I think that historical work can and should be creative. At the same time, I feel that we as scholars of history have entered into an agreement with our readers. And that agreement says we will ask questions, we will look for all the sources that we can get our hands on, all the sources that we can find. We will read them or listen to them or view them as faithfully as we can and try to arrive at our best interpretation, whether or not we like what that interpretation says. The way that we show our work in that process and the way that we express good faith with our interlocutors and our readers, I think, is to indicate our process throughout the work. So I do this at the beginning of the book, at the end, in an essay at the very end, and also in places throughout, and especially through the footnotes, because I want people who are willing to give me their time, which is, of course, very valuable and very precious. I want them to be able to follow me and to question me and to track what it is that I'm saying and asserting, and to decide whether or not they think that it's convincing, and to look it up themselves if they would like to. I think part of what I'm saying in that response is that I am very committed to the work that we both engage in, Tomiko, as scholars of the past, and to what we promise when we take up that work. And even when I try to write creatively and sometimes poetically, as I attempted in this book, as a way to try to just come close to the beauty of the thing itself, I know that I cannot achieve that. I mean, the sack is astonishing, but I wanted the writing to try to at least show respect for its beauty. Even though I'm doing that in this book, I also felt it was very important to have that kind of nuts and bolts element that would show what it was that I attempted to do, who it was that influenced me, who were the scholars that I read who were important, what was it that I couldn't find, where is it that I was speculating, and that I gave people the information they might need to pursue those sources on their own. On the question of writing in a different voice in various parts of the book, well, I feel that this book is all me. I don't know that I have different voices. May have different modes. And I will say that this has been the hardest book that I have ever written. This book was so hard to write for me. I think it has gone through 7 drafts. And when I say drafts, I mean deep revisions and rewrites. As I try to kind of get the structure right and try to get the 4 corners of the puzzle right, Tomiko, and try to write creatively, but then to pull that back when it wasn't working. The question of whether or not to write personally in the book was one that really came to me more toward the end of probably the 2nd draft. And I was really encouraged to write personally by fellows at Harvard University, at the Hutchins Center, who were really drawn to the spiritual aspects of the history and the emotional aspects of the history after they heard me give a talk about it, and just encouraged me to tell more about my family story. And so I did that and tried to contain some of that. I mean, you'll find that aspect of the book really at the beginning and maybe in some of the images and the captions. But I don't think it was a different voice. I think it was all my voice writing in a different mode. One, let's call it an academic creative mode, or a poetic mode of historical writing, and the other more of a personal mode of things that I had learned through my own family's oral history.
Mm. So let me connect that thought to another question, which is a viewer asking if you can say a little bit about the quilt that's hanging behind you, which you said came from.
Oh, yes. Um, that question comes at the perfect time of our conversation. So thank you for whoever submitted that. This is a part of what I discuss that stems from my family history, my family oral history in the introduction. This quilt was made by a great aunt of mine, and her name was Margaret, and she was a hero to my grandmother. I never met this great aunt, but my grandmother adored her. She was my grandmother's big sister, and my grandmother gave my great aunt Margaret, her sister Margaret, credit for basically saving the spirit of their family when their family was run off of their family farm in Mississippi, and then became impoverished. And what my grandmother credits her sister Margaret with is saving one cow, just saving one cow from their farm and taking it to a neighbor's house so that they could later recover it. This quilt was my grandmother's until she passed away, and then it was passed down to me. And it moves me because it reminds me of those women. It brings them to the fore of my thoughts. It makes me appreciate how far I have come and how far my generation has come from the times that they lived in, when they had to be terrified of a particular kind of racial violence, which was allowed and accepted by society. We still see racial violence, of course, but now it is supposed to be against the law. So this quilt is very special to me, and it's a reminder, it's a touchstone of those women and of the ways in which they lived brave lives.
Hmm. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. As we're ending, I want to say thank you so much, Tiya, for being with us today and for sharing this really important and personal history with us. I also want to thank the audience for your excellent questions. And I hope many of you will join us next week for our next book talk on Tuesday, July 27th, when the political scientist Dan Carpenter and the historian Nikki Taylor will engage in conversation about Dan's new book, Democracy by Petition. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a nice evening.